The first two questions in the question and answer part of the chat relate to exactly some of what Serene has spoken about, which is to do with legal reform and administrative justice, and making punitive measures possible, stopping the impunity. And I wondered whether Dolores, Nancy, and Serene would like to comment on and probably starting with Nancy and then Dolores, commenting on the kind of legal reform measures that are essential for us to tackle this, to visibilize it and to tackle it. Nancy, can I start with you first?
Certainly. Yes, you know, when I first started working on sextortion, people would always ask about the laws. And at the time, my feeling was that we weren't doing enough to use the existing laws, and that you needed a certain awareness and political will before you could get the momentum to pass bespoke laws. And I now have come to believe that now we definitely need more bespoke laws, because there is that imprecise fit. So many anti-corruption laws, sometimes even when they use general language about advantages or benefits, you have people who interpret them as requiring evidence of financial harm, because that's just how people are programmed to think about corruption and integrity. And I had a fascinating conversation with some anti-corruption officials and judges in Tunisia, where half of the room, and Tunisia has a very broad statute, you know, any benefit whatsoever is the kind of language that is used. But half of them felt that didn't provide sufficient guidance, notice to potential perpetrators that a sexual bribe would be an offense under the act. And so they would not have read the language as broadly as it was written. The other half, of course, had no trouble saying, you know, any benefit whatsoever clearly includes a sexual benefit. But this remains a challenge, and so I think there is that even though most countries have some laws that would cover some sextortion conduct, not all countries have one as specific as Tanzania's, that crafting laws that deal specifically with this is important. The other aspect of it that is important is what happens to the victim in these situations, because a lot of bribery laws certainly view paying a bribe as making you criminally liable in the same way as accepting a bribe. And clearly in not only in sextortion, but I believe actually in much petty corruption, it is the local official who has the power, and it is the poor person who is trying to obtain a license for a business, or to get healthcare, or to do, you know, access water and sanitation services, that is being forced by virtue of the circumstances, the need that the person has and the power that this official exercises to pay money the person can't afford, or in some instances to pay with sex. And the notion that we treat the two as equally responsible, I think, is troublesome across the board. And it may be that sextortion will also be a window for helping us to re-examine some of the ways we deal with petty corruption. But I should probably stop there and let someone else have a chance to chime in.
Thank you, Nancy. Incredibly important insights around crafting laws, but also reporting mechanisms, right? So putting the operational side of those laws in place. Dolores, your thoughts on legal reform reporting mechanisms?
Yes, well, I need to agree with Nancy. We talk a lot about this with her. This risk, because many bribery laws hold the person who pays the bribe also liable. And I mentioned in my 5-minute presentation the case of Tanzania, because it's very, very interesting. They have a section in the anti-corruption law that specifies sexual favors, and is very clear in that cases where sex is the currency of the bribe, the only person who is going to be held liable is the person with entrusted authority. So this is great. And then, of course, there is a gap between the law and how much is used in practice, right? We now going through the cases, and there are some cases in education where this has been used to prosecute the person with a trusted authority. But I think that the discussion, when we talk about sextortion, the discussion always needs to come back to the point in which we agree that it's the person with entrusted authority that is responsible for sextortion. So I think really we do not need to go into what the victim did or did not. Was it consent? Was it because there is much risk in those kind of discussions. So we need to really come back to the main point: who is the person who is responsible? Because anybody can come and offer whatever they want, but it's the person with entrusted authority who is the one who needs to say no. And I stay there also.
Thank you very much. I see Rob and Diana too. I'm not sure who of you were first, but maybe let's start with Diana and move on to Rob. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Alana. So here in Mexico, we have a proposed change for the federal law of penal procedures in 2021. And this was made by a congresswoman who is proposing to change the law to punish persons, first, to distinguish sexual extortion from other types of gender violence. So this is one of the main changes. And second, she also proposed to punish with a harder, I'm sorry, I forgot the word, a harder punishment for persons that are public servers and do these kind of practices. So we are starting the discussion here in Mexico. It's really initial, the conversation, as Jorge said, the concept is really new in Mexico, but there is also some of awareness between the people making the laws about the need to distinguish this type of violence. And I think that is important. However, we do have the challenge to document how big is the problem. So I think this is one of the main research that are going to contribute to that.
Wonderful, essential. Thank you. Great input, Rob.
Thanks. It's a really interesting discussion. The discussion about asymmetric liability. I mean, this is something that's being tested in the kind of behavioral economic sense with kind of petty bribery, and the kind of asymmetric enforcement is good at deterring kind of harassment bribery, but actually increases the rates, increases the confidence someone can have in paying a collusive bribe, because you now have a way to enforce that the person you've bribed will come through. And a fear I would have if there was kind of obviously it shouldn't be illegal to do this, but there has to be very careful that laws aren't in place that might give people a better confidence that they can ensure that the other party comes through. I think that has to be designed really, really carefully. I think a really good model for reporting of this stuff, though, is something like I Paid a Bribe, which was an interesting initiative set up to try to track petty bribery. And I think the reputational risk to people from being outed as even likely to have been involved in soliciting sexual bribes and sexual harassment could be quite effective at deterring people. You can everyone has a phone these days. You can geotag where the event happened. You kind of skirt the need to go to the authorities and reveal yourself, which can be very difficult in some circumstances. So I think someone should throw a chunk of change at a kind of a sextortion version of iPaidAbribe.com.
Thanks. Great idea. Nancy, I see you have a follow-up point. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to note that we don't yet have model language for this. And there are a number of points that I think will be important as we think about legislation. One is that it needs to not be limited to women. So often the draft language, we focus on the harm to women, but as we've noted, others can be victims as well. And I personally believe it is also very important not to have the laws, one, limit the types of sexual favors. I've seen laws that deal, for example, with rape, but they don't deal then with other kinds of, I've seen cases where people have been asked to pose for nude photos or submit to paddling. There's a whole range of offensive things, even deliver a daily kiss. And third, there is often a tendency, in part because people want to protect the victim and not punish the victim, to require some elevated showing of coercion. And as people have described, these circumstances are inherently coercive. If you're waiting in a kilometer-long mile to get, water, that creates a certain desperation. This is a basic necessity. If you can't operate your business without that permit, what are you going to do? And if you have no other source of income? So the circumstances are inherently coercive. But what happens when, in an effort to protect women and to differentiate this from other forms of petty corruption, is that we end up sort of feeding back into what historically has been a problem with gender-based violence laws, which is that showing that, this was not consensual, that you were in fact forced, that there was a gun to your head or a knife to your throat. And all of that is not helpful. It has not been helpful traditionally in dealing with gender-based violence, but it's also not helpful from an integrity standpoint. Because as Dolores says, integrity at the end of the day is really enforced by the person who is entrusted with the responsibility. We give that responsibility to a person and expect that person to exercise it in accordance with the applicable rules and regulations and expectations of the community. And when you engage in sextortion, that is not what you're doing. You are doing it for personal benefit. And we should not lose sight of that. And in that regard, I appreciate what Rob is saying about asymmetrical enforcement, but the integrity effort and focus does need to remain there. And so I hope in thinking about how we draft these bespoke laws, that these are all considerations.
Wonderful, thank you, Dolores. I see you've withdrawn your hand. Is that intentional?
Yes, because I was going to say what I'm going to
Okay.
say, but I remember because we wrote about this Norwegian case and a case in Sweden, and we look into the all the criminal procedures and the laws. So there weren't laws for sextortion, but the laws of abuse of authority in Norway and the laws of rape and harassment in Sweden were used to prosecute these persons, this major in Norway and a counselor here in Sweden, and the victims were young men. So you can read our chapter because it's very, very interesting. And so there are ways, and I agree with Nancy in what she's saying. Yeah.
Very strong. Won't you please pop some of your readings into the chat? Some links would be really great. Thank you.